The title of the session is Class Struggle or Love Thy Neighbour. Our two speakers are David Walker, who is a Bishop of Manchester, and Rosamund John Webster. You have 10 minutes to start, and then 26.
So we live in a world in which enough food is grown to feed everyone, in which the productive capacity of humankind could meet the needs of each and every human being on the planet. And yet we live in a world where every day children die of starvation or from preventable diseases, or they're blown to pieces in one of the dozens of conflicts which rage around the world. Because we live under capitalism, an economic system designed not to meet human need, but to create wealth for a minority class through the exploitation of the labour power of the many. And that system leaves a tide of destruction in its wake. In Britain today, the wealth of the richest 1,000 totals 547 billion. That's twice what it was in 2009. So while we've been tightening our belts, the rich have been getting richer. And a study by the High Pay Centre shows that in Britain today, the living conditions of the poor aren't really comparable to countries in the west of Western Europe, but more like the working class in Slovenia and the Czech Republic. And that is getting worse. Our rich are getting richer and our poor are getting poorer. So in the face of this, what do we do? What do we call for? How do we make a better world? The title of this debate is Class Struggle or Love Thy Neighbour, and the title kind of suggests that it's a debate about different strategies to achieve some sort of common goal. So if we share a common goal, some common ground with the Church of England, in the face of the barbarity of capitalism, what might that be? In the run-up to the general election, the church bishops produced a letter entitled Who is My Neighbour?, which professes to seek political answers that will enhance human dignity, rebuild communities, promote fairness, protect our natural environment. Yeah, we want to do that? So I thought, is this debate about different strategies to common goals? Are we, Trotskyists, unlikely but happy bedfellows of the Church of England? I had a moment of political crisis, but we're not. Very far from it. This is not a cosy debate of compadres, and not least because you believe in God and we don't. It's because I think the contribution to politics offered by the bishops is actually deeply regressive and backward-looking. The basic thrust of their argument. It's the concepts of mutuality and solidarity between people have been eroded, that communities face disintegration and individuals are left isolated in need. So far, so true. But the blame for this is apportioned equally between the ravages of the free market and the creation of the welfare state. Both apparently undermined voluntarism and neighbourliness. I think what they're essentially talking about as a way forward is going back to an idea of local charity, or big charity. So instead of expecting maintenance benefits, care in old age, support of children, care for the elderly, to be rights available to everybody, paid for through taxation, we should be lauding the adoption of these responsibilities by local communities. What this means in reality is that working class communities be expected to do this. Since when do the rich rely on the goodness of local charity or kindly neighbours to provide meals, transport, clothing, or help with rental mortgage payments? Since when do the well-off have to take a trip to their local food bank to feed their families or rely on services provided through charity? I hate charity. I think charity is an insult to the human dignity that the bishops say they want to enhance. Does the existence of a highly developed charitable sector mark out a progressive care in society? No, it doesn't. Charity exists because want, need and poverty exist. It isn't an answer, it's a symptom of a sick society. We have charities for everything, charities for cancer and other health research, when the drugs company GlaxoSmithKline reported pre-tax profits of $548 million for the last quarter of 2014. That's 3 months. 548 million. But doubtless the shareholders, who were due to receive another 4 billion in dividends through some share scheme or other, have given a bit to charity. So that's all right then. Charitable giving by the wealthy serves to salve consciences, if they have them. It's good for public image, makes people feel good about themselves. Think of all those posh charity lunches and dinners and events with the elite rubbing shoulders and slapping themselves on the back, maybe sharing canapes with the old bishop. Some of the biggest philanthropists are and have been the most vicious of exploiters. There's a document similar to the ones the bishops have written called Call to Action for the Common Good, and it's produced by the Carnegie Trust UK, which is a charitable trust set up by the US industrialist and steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, revered as one of the greatest philanthropists in history, really. who said that no man should leave this world with his wealth intact, a so-called progressive who supported trade unions until they got in his way. He presided over one of the biggest and most viciously repressed strikes in US labour history at his Homestead steel plant, utilising the state militia to violently put down the strike, to cut wages, sack workers, and broke the power of the Steelworkers Union. He is a wonderful example of the limits of the charitable approach. It's all very well giving away parts of your wealth, but who created the wealth in the first place? Carnegie was a venerable gentleman until the workers in his plant dared to suggest what he should do with his own private property. Then the true colours emerge. Know your place, workers of the world. It is for you to doff your caps. Be thankful for the crumbs swept from the master's plate. But don't dare to suggest that you do anything to the private property or the right of individuals to accumulate wealth on the back of the labour of the masses. Unfortunately, this is the kind of picture I get of the kind of society the bishops would be promoting. One of charity, self-sufficiency, respect for hierarchy, knowing your place. I'm reminded of the verse from All Creatures Great and Small. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. I'm not suggesting the bishop doesn't generally want to help the poor. The bishop's letter is clear. They offer more help, just treatment, fairness, etc., etc., etc. I've read some things that David Walker has said. He returns frequently to the concept of struggling against injustice, although he seems to equate some kinds of struggle against injustice with sin, as he quotes Martin Luther when he's talking about his own struggle, saying, if you must sin, sin boldly. And he criticises many Christians who he says are guilty of inaction through fear of error. But I wonder what Christians he's talking about who are guilty of inaction. Is it the ones who scream abuse at women going into abortion clinics? Or those who condemn same-sex marriage and gay relationships? Or maybe Bush and Blair, whose Christianity didn't stop them waging their wars in the name of God? Or maybe just your average pro-family, union-hating, homophobic, varying degrees of sexist, Tory-voting Anglican? David Walker does say good things about the bedroom tax and the homeless. I'm firmly convinced of his good intentions. But as we know, the road to hell is paved. Not liking to see suffering doesn't a radical agenda make. Without addressing how society is fundamentally organised, without challenging the private ownership of the means of production, you limit yourself to merely alleviating capitalism's worst excesses. What's interesting is that they do want to see provision for those in need, but seem to have a problem with the provision being via the state and through an organised redistribution of wealth. I think what's going on here is that the bishops are trying to create political space to gain more power for the church itself. Their view of society is backward because what they want is for the church to become a renewed power, a centre of communities, a conduit for charity and local organisation. I'll bet the Church of England look in envy at the power of churches and bishops in countries where religious belief is more entrenched than it is in modern-day Britain. The population of the UK is 64.1 million, and by the church's own figures, only about 1 million people attend church, and most of those are over 55. The British Social Attitude Survey found 50.6% of the population identify as no religion, and a YouGov poll put it at 77%. And even those who identify as Christian, when questioned further, a lot of them say they don't actually believe in God or Jesus. The Church of England membership has declined from 40% to just 16% of the population. I see an organisation of dwindling numbers, power and influence, desperately trying to find a place for itself as society moves forward and harking back to a golden age of the vibrant local parish where everyone knows everybody. When the class struggle sees the labour movement in the ascendancy, creating things like the welfare state, this challenges the place of the church. No longer is social provision the task of the pious, but to who the grateful poor must go with cap in hand in times of need. If basic maintenance, the care of the elderly, children, schooling, public services are provided by right through redistribution of wealth, organised by local or national government, then what point is there for the church as an intermediary organisation? They have a vested interest in a lesser welfare state. Maybe that's why they have these arguments about the welfare state undermining personal responsibility. Their language on this is softer than the Tories and the Daily Mail, but the political narrative is the same. The welfare state led to work-shy, dole scroungers and a culture of dependency. What we need is a little state support and leave the rest to neighbours, charity and the church. The dole scrounger or welfare dependent, whatever description you want to use, is one of the biggest myths of post-war Britain. The idea there has ever been welfare benefits that enable people to live well without working is a joke. And as for a culture of dependency, what is wrong with being able to depend on things, to depend on a job, to depend on food on your table, a good school for your kids and free healthcare? When the bishops published their Who is My Neighbour letter, the Daily Mail and various Tories called it a left-wing manifesto. I think that says more about quite how right-wing and ferocious the Tories are than it does about a letter which sings the praises of the Tories' own policy of big society, because that can't be called anything approaching left-wing. Do you remember big society? Raised by the Tories in the 2010 election. What it basically was shifting the cost of services from the state, encouraging social enterprises, volunteer activity, even private business to take over as much of local services as they could get away with. It was about leeching public money to fund free schools, further undermining our comprehensive education system and taking it further from any democratic control. Back to the days when any old person can set up a school outside of democratic control, teach whatever they like with no educational knowledge whatsoever. More faith schools, incidentally, means more room for the church to try to arrest its falling numbers. Coincidence? Who knows? Faith schools, the segregation of children by the religion of their parents. Who in this day and age thinks that this is a good idea? How is this meant to promote mutuality and solidarity and love of your neighbour? It promotes difference, and what it does is enable religious fanatics to set up schools that teach children they will burn in hell if they don't obey religious rules, or that the world was created in 7 days by God 10,000 years ago, otherwise known as teaching children lies. The Bishop's political treatise makes a big deal of promoting a new form of political method and new forms of political thinking. It attempts to be an even-handed criticism of both right and left approaches to politics. There's an interesting quote in a book called Mythologies by Roland Barthes. He says, "One reckons all the methods with scales, one piles them up on each side as one sees best, so as to appear oneself as the imponderable arbiter, endowed with a spirituality which is ideal and thereby just." The bishops portray themselves in just such a way, superior arbiters able to rise above the murky sea of factional politics. But this attempt at superior even-handedness results in statements that would be ridiculous if they weren't so dangerous. The bishops criticise othering and say ethnic minorities, immigrants, welfare claimants, bankers and oligarchs all have been called up as threats to some fictitious us. Can you seriously say that the racist scapegoating of black people and migrants and the mythologising lies told about welfare claimants can be put in the same boat with placing the blame for exploitation, poverty, financial collapse and economic chaos at the doors of bankers and oligarchs? You cannot treat these things with the same meaningless generalities about not creating others. And I would remind you of the Paulo Freire quote, "Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful and not to be neutral." But let's not for 1 minute think that the church is any kind of neutral force in politics. They raise concerns about the power of the state, but they are part of it. The Church of England has been a pillar of the British establishment since it was established, as Irish writer Brendan Behan put it, on the bollocks of Henry VIII. The Church of England used to be referred to as the Tories at prayer, and while I keep referring to them as separate entities, let's not forget that most Tories are members of the Church of England, and no matter what criticism the bishops might make of Tory policy, they will always welcome them back to the altar. We have 26 Lords Spiritual, unelected representatives of Jesus in government, and one improvement to our democracy would be to get rid of them. The Church's canon law forms part of civil law in the UK, so much so that the legislation on gay marriage had to explicitly state that gay marriage was illegal in the Church of England, so as not to contradict canon law and upset God, who apparently still thinks that gay relationships are not legitimate. The Church has considerable wealth of its own, around 5.2 billion, so I'd say they have a very vested interest in many areas, and class struggle, challenging capitalism, threatens that. One thing they really don't like to talk about is class. They attempt a kind of meta-analysis of post-war history, looking at the Thatcher and Attlee governments, but it's not much of an analysis. Basically, Attlee brought in the welfare state and undermined voluntarism. Thatcher supported the free market and individualism and undermined voluntarism. I haven't read something for a long time that's so self-consciously superior and yet so completely ahistorical, inaccurate and simplistic. To discuss these things without referring to the question of class and struggle is either a sign of willful misleading or a naivety so complete that you wonder in what world the bishops have been living. After the First World War, there was a wave of revolutionary working class militancy across Europe, and the ruling class at the end of World War II were afraid of the same thing. Quentin Hogg, the Tory MP in 1943, famously quoted as saying, "We must give them reform or they will give us revolution." The point I'm making here is that it was class struggle in which the Labour movement was in the ascendancy, which gave us the greatest set of reforms we've ever seen. It wasn't a benevolent gift of conscientious capital. And when Thatcher came to power, she came to fight for her class. She didn't want to free the market to serve the common good. She acted in the interests of her class, the ruling class, to enable the wealthy to accumulate as much wealth as they could and to claw back what had been won by the working class in the post-war period. Her government had a specific strategy to smash the organisations of the working class, throwing huge communities through deindustrialisation into poverty and degradation. How can communities support each other and be neighbourly when they're thrown as one into that kind of situation? The Church's letter makes more than one reference to the immoral nature of the free market, but the free market isn't a being. It doesn't exist beyond the people who buy, sell, trade and exploit. It's the people who make it work, and it is that class of people who lack the morals. The market isn't a force outside of human controls, it is the actions of one class exploiting another class. The bishops say we should ignore class and speak instead of warmer virtues, of mutuality and solidarity. So let's talk about that. I can think of an institution that typifies this perfectly, the NHS. It's there for everybody, to meet the need of everybody. It was a gain that transformed the lives of millions of working class people. Under Thatcher, attacks on the NHS saw the closure of hundreds of hospitals, and in an interesting statistic, the number of private beds rose by almost the same amount that the number of NHS beds was cut. Talk about doing a job for your class. Now they're back for our health service. So tell me, how should we defend the NHS? Love thy neighbour or class struggle? Setting up charities to fill the gap left by the cuts, or joining the picket line, supporting workers like the porters at Nine Wells and Royal Victoria in Dundee who've taken all out strike action to win their demands. We are for solidarity, but it's class solidarity, joining together against a common foe. The history of the Labour movement is strewn with examples of people standing shoulder to shoulder, brothers and sisters together, struggling for justice and a better world, supporting each other in times of hardship, emotionally, financially, a rich solidarity that has given people strength and courage in the most desperate struggles for community, for jobs, for their lives. And despite defeat, in victory or defeat, class solidarity has brought people hope and joy. Our movement has its own life-affirming stories, songs, traditions and culture, born from our history of solidarity. I don't know, assuming most people here have seen the film Pride, and there's the most beautiful rendition of the song Bread and Roses, which brings tears to your eyes, makes your heart feel strong. I will take our class solidarity every time and keep my hatred of the capitalist system, and I will hate and not love those who would defend it. What we need in moving forward is clarity. Why do we have poverty, injustice and inequality? It's because of capitalism. Our aim is not to tinker with this system, but to create a new one, where human need is paramount, where the economy is organised cooperatively to benefit the whole of humankind. This is our task. I think it is a bold one, and I invite you to join us.
Thank you for coming, David. David Walker, Bishop of Manchester.
Yeah. Thank you for your invitation. I'm very honoured. Let me try to scope the question I've been set tonight. I'm not here to defend religious faith in general as a force for good in society, although if we look at the history of this country, such things as hospitals actually began as religious foundations and are now properly part of the welfare provision that we all pay for and receive free of charge. Well, most of us do. I'm not here to defend the behaviour of religious institutions, and we could trade the Spanish Inquisition against Stalin until the cows come home, and neither of us are going to really support either of them. Nor am I here as somebody who studied the tradition of class war and therefore able to present a very detailed critique about it. I'm here, well, partly because the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, gave my name to Ed and said that maybe I should be invited. He would come and do it. I shall know whether Rowan's my friend still after tonight. I'm here because, yes, I'm known to have a strong reputation for speaking out and for practical action as well on social justice issues. A couple of years ago, when the Prime Minister, David Cameron, was about to make a speech against migration. The Observer newspaper tried ringing all the leaders of major political organisations in the country. None of them wanted to speak out, and I was the person that they came to who was prepared to speak out, say something about the benefits that those who come to this country from other parts of the world bring to us, to our economy, to our society, about the values of a diverse society, not a society that is monochrome. I was the person they had to come to say that. I'm here because sometimes the left, and that's a term which I'm presuming tonight we don't include the Labour Party in, have sometimes been my principal and even my only allies. When I was setting up with some colleagues a project to be the only non-profit making scheme to provide accommodation for asylum seekers and the dispersals of the early 2000s, I remember going to one public meeting. We're about to we bought up an old people's home that had gone bust in one particular town. We're going to use it to house asylum seekers, to treat them with dignity, which we thought would at least set a standard that might somehow challenge the rather poor standards that the private sector were setting up. It was actually the SWP that night who were my only allies I felt in the room. And I was grateful for that. I've been grateful for the left, for groups like Unite Against Fascism, who stood with me when the EDL have tried to come in and demonstrate in the places where I've been working. So I guess I'm repaying some of that debt that I owe to the left tonight, even if you're not members of those particular organisations. And I'm partly here because my anarchist daughter wouldn't forgive me if I turned down. But most of all, I'm here as asked to defend and promote a small phrase that first took shape in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, and which Jesus of Nazareth went on to make the centre point of his teaching. Love your neighbour as yourself. So who is my neighbour? As far as Jesus is concerned, it's not the person who's like me. It's not the person whose interests are my own. He founds it in the story of the Good Samaritan, the guy who's been beaten up by brigands, who's left to die by the roadside, and the person who comes and helps him is the person who ought, by every standard of the day, to have hated him, to have despised him, to have left him there to die. His own obvious neighbours that simply walk past on the other side of the road. I'm here because I believe in neighbourliness, more important than ever in an increasingly segregated society. At least 150 years in the height of the Industrial Revolution, at least the mill owners had to live sufficiently close to the working men and women of their factories that they sometimes actually saw what they were suffering. Nowadays, they live so far away, so segregated, they've got no idea of what's going on at all. I'm here because I'm a follower of Jesus after the example of St. Francis of Assisi, who always sought out those who were the most segregated and rejected in society, lepers in particular in his day, and sought to do something to be alongside them and to be of some use, some aid, some support, to show some solidarity with them. That's the background to the letter that the bishops wrote before the last general election. Yes, it wasn't a particularly strident letter, it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be something that would engage with the average voter, something that the average person in the street could read and maybe find something in there that would help them to decide the questions they might want to ask of politicians who were standing for election in that particular general election. So it was aimed at the parties that were taking part in that election, the large parties who most people would be voting for, and aimed at giving churchgoers an opportunity to think of the questions they might want to put and the things they might want to decide before they came to cast their vote. It's been pitched that the letter is against the welfare state. The letter is not against the welfare state. One of the co-founders of the welfare state, one of the men whose vision actually led to its creation, was a guy called William Temple. Between 1920 and 1929, William Temple held the post that I now hold. He was the Bishop of Manchester. He went on to be Archbishop of York and eventually died just before the end of the Second World War as Archbishop of Canterbury. Temple was as important as Beveridge or anybody else to the founding of the welfare state. So the church is not in opposition to the welfare state. We're just concerned that there needs to be more than what the welfare state provides. Not least because society as a whole, the consensus within the society, is so far away at this present time from accepting any level of welfare provision that is adequate for the needs of people who are caught at the bottom of the pile of our society. So charity may not be a permanent solution, but charity is what is needed at this moment. I don't take the view, and this might be something you want to debate about, I don't take the view that you leave things as bad as they are in order to provoke revolutionary zeal among the people. That is not how I believe we should work. I believe that where there is human need, practical human need, that we can do something about here and now, I believe that there is an onus upon us to do it. That is neighbourliness. That is loving our neighbour. And so the charity that I'm involved in, and that Christians like me are involved in, never salves our consciences. Actually, what it does is it raises our consciences. It helps us to understand much better the plight of those who may not have been as fortunate as some of us are. Back in the 1990s, a group of us were involved in setting up a project called Night Stops. And Night Stops, very simple idea. Teenagers had fallen out with whoever they lived with, their mum, their stepdad, whoever it may be. Often then the first reaction was to get on a train down to London, down to here. There were paedophiles waiting for them at King's Cross, at Euston, at all the main terminal stations to pick up young kids who were vulnerable, who just arrived in London. We set up night stop teams around the country where somebody who got a spare room would give that room for the night to that teenager who'd just run away from home and who we'd managed to stop getting on that train down to London to where they would be prey for somebody far more powerful and sophisticated and manipulative than themselves. What did it do? Yeah, it brought some cooling off time for some kids to go back home afterwards. For other kids for whom going back home was not the right option, it bought some space in which they could find what the right solution for them would be. But the key change that made was actually the largely older, middle-class people with the spare rooms who hosted those kids for a night or a couple of nights didn't have to change their social attitudes as a result of doing so. That was education through charity, and the people being educated were the people who initially thought they're going to be the donors. I see that now. You mentioned about food banks a few minutes ago, Rosie. I never go to a church nowadays without seeing a box or something for the food bank at the back of the church. It's the churches across the country that have enabled food banks to spread as widely as they have. Now, I regret the need for food banks. I don't think a sophisticated society like Britain ought to be depending on food banks. But what food banks do is several things. Firstly, they provide an immediate relief for an immediate need. For that person, and many of them who come to the food bank, they're there because they've had a benefit sanction, they've had a benefit cut, they've had a delay in the payment of some benefit because they've had a slight change in their circumstances, or they're there because they're in work poor and something broke that they need to spend money to fix, and the outgoings and the incomings just don't match for the next few weeks until they've paid off what they've had to borrow. So they're there to meet that immediate practical need, and that's the sort of thing that for me is always the beginning. But then you go on from that. The food banks are there to provide a gateway to the other services, many of them run by the state, many of them very properly run by the state. I want to encourage that and to grow them. That's not what's happening, of course, at the moment, because the government are constantly trying to cut back on welfare services and services for those in need. But we can get the evidence from those food banks of the people why they're there, what has led them to that point, and we can use that then to challenge government, to challenge society around us, to say, wake up, this is what's actually happening. And thirdly, as with the Night Stop schemes, what we find is the people who volunteer, the people who help out in those food banks, actually they are changed as a result of it. Now, they may not all be coming here on a Friday night and wanting to join this particular weekend, this particular organisation, but they are different people when they have got alongside with, spent time with those who are in immediate need in our society. When I go round to one of our churches, we have a rota during the winter so that we try to reduce the number of people who are sleeping rough on the streets. Particularly in the winter months, we try and have at least somewhere for people to dot down overnight, where they get a hot meal when they get there, they get a bed for the night, they get a shower in the morning and change of clothes if they want it, and they get to breakfast with local people. I don't know, I'm sure it does good for those who are homeless to engage in real human conversation. I know it does good for those typically church members who come and cook their supper, who come and have breakfast with them, who stay with them overnight in the churches that are open for that purpose. Charity is not an alternative to the welfare state. Charity is part of the gateway to the welfare state, and it's part to supplement those things that are not most effectively delivered in the sort of way that the state delivers things. And I guess that's where we might want to differ. I don't think that the state is the most efficient organisation or mechanism for delivering everything that needs to be delivered to meet the vast range of human need that we have. But my vision is of a good society, and I don't think it's very different from yours. One where all have space to flourish, to reach their potential. And part of that potential is about being able to serve others in their need. Part of our humanity is not simply to stand on rights, but to actually give and to receive from one another. I believe in a society where the institutions serve the people, not the other way around. Where dignity and respect are not dependent on some measure of status, whether it's birth or education or colour or sexuality or anything like that, or gender. And I guess those are aims that we're largely, I hope, in this room, in agreement over. But I believe that to do that, we have to follow the kind of model that the American sociologist Bob Putnam sets out when he develops his theory of social capital. There are three sorts of social capital in our societies. There's bonding, what you get when people of like interests come together. There's bridging, what you get when people of very different interests come together. And there's linking, what you get when you enable small local organisations to have some interaction with and potentially exercise influence over much bigger organisations. And all the studies around that model of social capital, which for me is an enormous potential agent for change, show that it's churches and other religious institutions that are sort of prime places where that happens, where people meet others who are not like themselves, where they're not members of the same golf club or the same bridge club or whatever middle class convention you might want to think about. I do worry about othering, and we raise that strongly in our letter. I worry about the othering that's contained in the myth of the three generations workless family, because nobody's ever found one of these families yet. If they did, they'd have their own column on the Daily Mail every week, and they wouldn't be workless anymore. I'm enraged by attempts to recreate distinctions between the deserving and the undeserving poor. I think those should have properly gone at the time of Victoria, and they're creeping back into society, and I certainly don't want no part of them doing so. I'm angry at the othering of migrants, when all evidence is that those who come to this country build our society and build our economy. But colluding with the ideology of othering, I don't think is the way for the left to go. Simply deciding it's a different lot of others who are the other, who are to be hated. That kind of works in the short term. It works, when, I suppose, when you're a small organisation with relatively little power and influence. But what it... Well, we're not a million here. We're not quite a million here tonight, but I'm sure there'll be that number listening in. And the trouble with othering is that othering is inevitably, I think, will end up being a tool that the powerful use against the weak. That othering is a weapon that is far more effective in the hands of those who have power. And sadly, wherever we've looked in the past, where too often where the left has gained control for a long time, and we look at Russia, and we look at China, and we look at other places, too often, Albania, too often othering has then carried on within the hands of the powerful as a tool against the weak. And so I worry about othering. I worry about that sense of colluding with, drawing up, encouraging a sense of hatred, because once you put hatred into the system, it's hard to get rid of it. And if, by luck you happen to win, and if by luck you happen to get to that place where you are in control, where you are the one who have the power and the authority, I think it's very hard then to get rid of that othering if that has been the way that you've had to fight to get there in the first place. I believe in starting with individual need. That's how I started, that's what got me interested, excited. I moved much more to the left when I became a Christian in my teens than I'd been before that point. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, one of my heroes, says this. He says, there comes a point when you've fished enough bodies out of the river that it's time to take a walk upstream and to look who's chucking them in. And I think that, for me, is a very important statement. We don't just look at the effects of oppression, the effects of inequality in our society, but when we've done that, we go back upstream and begin to tackle the causes. But for me, that is done by being the sort of people who enhance, build on the welfare state, the sort of people who enable others, as well as ourselves, engaging with people who are unlike ourselves, developing a solidarity that goes beyond class, beyond gender, beyond race, beyond religion, beyond sexuality, beyond education, beyond any of those dividers in our society. And I think that is a more effective means of making change in society. And that's why I'm going to carry on trying to love my neighbour, including all of you here tonight.
Thank you, Rosie and David. Am I supposed to call you David?
Yeah, David. My mother called me that, and it seems to
I wasn't supposed to ask that, though, was I? Okay, we've got time now for contributions from the floor. So if you have a question or a point you'd like to make, just raise your hand. At the back there to start.
Hi, my name is Alice, and it's just facing the both of your speakers as you go, but I'm really sorry. It was really do inspiring speech, but don't you agree that the David, it's that and the Rosie, that the way to come, that maybe this uses the same aim, the welfare and more equality, but what you differ, and that is not a little different, but a big difference, is on the nature you see the society. One is a society where you cannot oversee the divide of society by class, by color, by sexuality, or by gender, and the other seems to embrace the community as just one, and don't you think that's where you differ, and then this, you have two different approaches to achieving the goal, radically different, and that's so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Dan, I'm a member of Left Unity. Yeah, I mean, I've been an atheist all my life and a communist for the majority of it. And while, like, obviously everything Rosie said, you know, I pretty much agree with, I do think that we have to take a bit more of a nuanced approach to religion. I mean, firstly, when we talk about the irrelevance of the church, we come from a point, sadly, where socialists and communists are a tiny, tiny irrelevance compared, you know, to the church and where we're at. The vast majority of the world believes in religion, and actually religious ideas, as a percentage of the global population, is growing. And I think that when we talk about religion and charity, we can't just do it in a way of saying, you know, that confirms that we're right for socialists and communists. Because although I believe that, I'm not sure it's the best way to try and convince people with religious ideas and break from those ideas and come over to kind of class-conscious socialist ideas. And, you know, when Marx talked about religion, on one hand, there was the thing that a lot of people know about religion being the opium of the masses. But on the other hand, he said that, you know, religion is the heart in a heartless world. And he said that, you know, we can't just pull the flowers of religion from the chains of oppression and expect people, you know, to then stand there, you know, and come over to socialism. Because if anything, if you take away those flowers and put nothing in its place, then people will become more demoralised and demotivated in struggles. And I think when we talk about religions, despite all the kind of barbaric things that religious institutions have done over the, you know, centuries, at the same time, we do have to recognise that a lot of people turn to religion, you know, for hope in a very desperate and unequal world. And when, you know, we talk about charity, again, I'd agree with you that it's terrible that charity's there, and charities are often there for extremely cynical reasons of the rich. But at the same time, you know, when you look at studies, percentagely, people on lower incomes are more likely to give to charity. And I think that there's an element of charity where people give because they see suffering around them, which is a good thing. Now, that doesn't mean that charities are right, but it doesn't. I don't think that if we just dismiss them in quite a, you know, that they're all rubbish. So that I'm not sure that will link in with, like, in terms of changing people's views. And in terms of things like food banks and everything else, I think, to be honest, if the left and the trade union movement were more relevant in this country, we'd be setting up food banks and we'd be setting up things. You know, obviously we defend the welfare state, but we also, if that's not there, you know, there's nothing wrong with trying to step in and build solidarity. And we do that in a way of solidarity, not charity, which obviously is an important difference. But yeah, so like I said, although I'd be interested to hear what other people think, but for me, I think if we want to convince people with religious ideas, obviously that will come mainly through class struggle and people's material reality. But in terms of to help that, I personally think we have to take a bit more of a softer approach in terms of what religion is, while obviously condemning the barbaric things of like what religious institutions do.
Quickly, just come back on that. Religion is growing. It's growing in some cases. It's declining in others. It's, you know, we've got to, we live in a world that's vastly differentiated. I'll tell you what is growing, and that's millenarianism. And you know, there's very fundamentalist Christianity or very fundamentalist Islam, and we can't just simply have a softer approach to that. We have to actually have a very realistic and confrontational, intellectual confrontation with that. It's not about giving people hope, it's about people who are fantastically desperate in some cases, but also people who have been cynically manipulated, and people who are using the vast, brutal inequalities that there are in the world in order to recruit their causes. And, you know, I find it very upsetting to walk down Peckham High Street and see people claiming that they will make people rise from their wheelchair, that they can win the lottery, that they can become a business person and become millionaires, and all of this kind of thing. You know, if that is hope, that's not hope. That's not human hope. That's cynical manipulation. So I think we have to take, yes, we have to take a nuanced picture of it, but we actually have to recognise that there's a lot of different things going on with religion in society. One of those things, which I think Rosie did address, was where we are at, which is where there is a political debate going on about the future of the welfare state. And I think that's what Rosie was trying to intervene into, and that's the debate I think we're having tonight. And so I think you have to ask yourself some questions about what charity is. And it's not that it's a bad thing. I mean, Crisis at Christmas, last 2 years I put my name down for it. I wanted to go and help out at the school where my partner works, but even though I put my name down in October, I wasn't accepted because lots of middle-class people with who know how to do these things have got there first. They didn't need me, right? Why didn't they need me? Because there's only there's only a finite amount of stuff that they do at Christmas. There's only a finite amount of money that charity has, even though the particular school where I was going to volunteer for is largely run by the City of London. Do the City of London have more money and more resources to do more at Christmas? Of course they do, but they don't. So charity is a finite thing. That's the problem. No matter whatever your good intentions, it's always going to be a finite thing. Unless you can actually change the inequality in the world, the fundamental inequality in the world, then you're always going to hit that barrier. And I think that's the debate we're having tonight. I mean, I could say more, but I think.
Thank you.
I was a fairly long-standing supporter of workers' liberty. I don't think agree with Rosie about hating charity. This may just be me because I've worked for one.
All the more reason to hate them, frankly.
I'm trying to survive the cognitive dissonance. Charity I work for set up to support black communities combating HIV, principally African communities in number of places, led by people from those communities. The money for that's gone down quite a lot lately. Never the sexiest or most popular group of people with the establishment or the Tories, African refugees, you know, sort of not the easiest to bucket shake for in some parts of the world either. But suddenly over the last few months, my charity's been terribly courted by drug companies who, around a linked condition, well, often linked condition to HIV, called hepatitis C. Interestingly, GlaxoSmithKline, Bristol Myers Squibb, a number of other major drug companies have come up with essentially a cure for this blood-borne virus. It costs $1,000 per tablet. So they're quite interested in motivating people to demand the treat. You know, and as someone who works in a charity, that's not where I want to be. And their interest and influence and benevolence isn't about curing a pretty horrible condition that can give you liver disease and liver cancer. It's about the $1,000 a tablet that they expect out of the NHS. So I think even those of us who work in charities, well, probably especially those of us who work in charities, you know, need to know, are we going to be taken for a ride? Because class, money, the drive for profit is still there behind things. You know, however nice we are, yeah, there's a bigger driver for a lot of people. Well, I must admit, mind you, I did use their rail ticket to come down to London for a meeting on Thursday to come here. Well, you know, hey, none was perfect. Yeah.
Daniel.
My name's Daniel. I'm a member of Workers' Liberty. I was a religious Jew until the age of 15, but I'm an atheist now, so I think we should all announce our religious provenance before we begin our contribution. I wanted to make 4 quick points in response to things that David said. And by the way, I want to thank you on behalf of Workers' Liberty for attending. There's not many of your fellow people of the cloth that I think would have, or members of any clergy that would have done this. I think it was an interesting contribution you gave, and you debated in good faith, so to speak. So the things I wanted to respond to, 3 very, very quickly, and then 1 quite quickly. So you talked about the problems with states like China and Albania and Russia. I mean, presumably you know that this is an audience comprised of probably the most virulently anti-Stalinist group on the left, or rather an event organised by such a group. So that's probably not a fruitful terrain to debate on. Secondly, you said you didn't think that the state was necessarily the right mechanism to be providing everything that people needed in society. Well, I think we'd agree. We're not kind of statists. We don't believe that state ownership or state control in and of itself is progressive. Just the opposite, in fact. And I mean, those 2 points are linked. I mean, our critique of capitalism, of Stalinism, sorry, very much linked to our critique of statism. So we're not arguing for state control of everything. You also asked the question about, is it our view or positive the possibility that it might be our view that it would be better if everyone was completely immiserated, and then that would kind of make them realise how terrible everything was and they'd rise up. That isn't really our view at all, and I think history shows rather the opposite, that it's when people are at their most immiserated, that's when they're least likely to draw what we would call revolutionary conclusions or develop revolutionary consciousness. And actually, when people are a bit more comfortable and secure, that's a better place to be in to draw those conclusions. The final point, which is I think the most important one, is that I think really the heart of the argument and the heart of the debate was illustrated by something you said right at the start of your contribution, where you talked about how at the beginnings of industrial capitalism, a mill owner might live close enough to their worker to see their suffering, and the implicit subtext being, and maybe do something about it, whereas now your kind of hyper-capitalist, the oligarch, lives in some figurative or literal ivory tower and will never see the suffering of the people they employ. I think that really gets to the heart of the issue, and I think it shows that David essentially sees the problem as one of personal morality, as one of people making bad choices or doing bad things, and that if they did those, if they were made to make other choices or to make other moral decisions, society would be better. Well, I guess, you know, would it be better if all bosses were kind of sort of inclined to be social reformers rather than, you know, vicious exploiters? Well, I suppose so, but essentially the difference is that we don't see the problem in society as being one of personal morality. It's a structural question. The reason the mill owner exploits the mill worker isn't that they don't live close enough to them to observe their suffering, or even that they don't care about their suffering. I'm sure a lot of them do, and I'm sure a lot of them would like, you know, the modern day mill owners would like their workers to suffer less. It's that they're locked into a structural relationship whereby one exists by exploiting the other, and the other is forced to exist by selling their labour power to the other. And questions of personal morality, well, that's fine, and I would like it if people had a more acute sense of personal morality, but that isn't going to solve the problem. What's going to solve the problem is a struggle that can explode, overturn and overthrow that relationship, and that is essentially the difference.
Thank you. If anyone does love their neighbour, or more specifically wants to argue this side of the debate, if you kind of wave your arms around, then I will take you earlier. Also, if you want to come back, just let us know.
Yes, hi, I'm Malcolm. I'm the son of a retired Methodist minister, and I've been an atheist since 2003. I'm not so much a Marxist atheist, more of a Darwinist atheist, if you can understand that. And my reason for rejection of religion is due to the fact that in 2003 the Iraq War happened, and I didn't wish to believe in the same God as either George W. Bush or Tony Blair, which is fairly straightforward. I found myself being, any time that I've been to any of my father's sermons or, you know, being in churches, I found myself, after becoming an atheist, becoming more interested in it as a form of, you know, looking at it from the outside in, it makes me more interested. I'm less likely to fall asleep during sermons. Which is slightly ironic. There you go. One thing as well, I'm no longer a member of church or anything like that, but I am a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Labour Party. Work out that... yeah, okay. It's a bit of a strange one, but I've attended branch meetings of both organisations in the last 48 hours. And one thing I've noticed is that the congregation, if you will, tends to be more of your sort of age than your sort of age, generally, and that both, you know, activists in leftist activists and Labour Party, and it's probably also true, even more so of the Conservative Party, which is even older, that actual participation in believing in something, believing in anything, is woefully in decline. And I wondered how it would be. You know, I was talking to the guys in the Labour Party yesterday. I was wondering how it was the case that between 1997 and 2001, even though nothing controversial like the banking crisis or MP's expenses or even the Iraq War had happened, like 2.8 million people didn't vote Labour between those times, even though nothing controversial had happened. Where do we go from here? How do we make people, whether it be Marxist organisations like this one, or church organisations like your one, or anything in between, or Labour Party, or whatever you will, or even, God offend the Tories. How do we make people more active in believing anything?
Okay, so a few things. Sorry, my name's Sasha Ismail. A few things. Firstly, I think Malcolm's example is an interesting one, and it goes to the heart of why the left is not in a very good position, which is, I mean, take the Socialist Workers' Party. If you went to one of their meetings 5 years ago, they would have been a lot younger, and they lost almost all their young members because of something they did.
Gone to RS21.
Well, most of them actually just scattered to the wind.
Yeah.
But my point is not specifically about this SDP. It's that the left, including the far left, has made serious mistakes over a very long period of time, which have not only meant that we, in a general sense, have missed opportunities, but also that organisations shoot themselves in the foot. And that isn't just true of losing young members because of sexual assault scandal. It's also true of messing things up in the unions, messing things up in strikes, messing things up in all kinds of struggles. So I think we need a better left, a better socialist left, and that's what our organisation is about trying to create. And even within the socialist left, it's not a battle, but I think it's one worth having. The second thing I would say is that I'm very much in favour of religious and non-religious people cooperating together in the struggle. So I'm right, well, including in the struggle now, but I was thinking about it because I'm writing a pamphlet about the American Civil War, because in November it's the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in America. And in the militant wing of the anti-slavery movement, religious and non-religious people cooperated together. And most people, to be honest, were religious. Most militant people, black and white, generally speaking, were religious. But they were a type of religious activist who I think were very different from, with all due respect, what we've heard from David, which is that they believed that there was a structural injustice in society that had to be overthrown. They wanted to take militant action to overthrow it. That included defying the government, included breaking the law, included using violence. And in most respects, they were much more something of the type that we're trying to build than I think the type we've heard from David's side tonight. So I want some of those religious people. Where are they? Sometimes you meet them in trade union branches, and very occasionally we have a few in our own organisation, Workers' Liberty, and that's okay. But there's not that many. Or at least not that many who define themselves by their religion, which I think is an important point. And the last thing is a question for David, and I was trying to think how to pose this question in a way that didn't kind of sound unpleasant. So I'm going to ask it as a question, which is, do you think that Anglican bishops, and I assume there are ranks above bishops, so the higher ones as well, but including your rank, do you think that you're overpaid?
Right, thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm just concerned that while I would also refer to charity supplementing welfare statement, we've got to be careful we don't endorse substituting.
Yeah.
And I think this Tory government will be more than happy to sit back and let the church encourage people to substitute what they should be doing, what we paid for, what we do. And just another very quick point, this isn't going to take too much time. But food banks where I live, I know you said within your church community. I don't imagine Manchester's that far away socially to where I'm from, or only half an hour, 40 minutes drive away. And the food banks that I've had any experience of where I live, it's actually the poor people who are donating to them, volunteering at them. And generally when I walk around my local supermarket, the people who've got a food bank walk past the trolley for the local food bank, walk past the box outside the church, and that saddens me. So I don't think that what you're, and I think it's very nice, and it would be lovely if what you were saying
people who are going to church are separate because of class. So I think there is a place for religion in society because people want to take things that people's faith from them, what they believe in, what makes them feel better. I'm not a practicing Catholic, although I was christened Catholic, Roman Catholic, and educated in Roman Catholic schools. Not trying to undermine people's right to have their faith, but I do think we've got to be very, very careful because it's predominantly it is a classroom.
Thank you.
Okay. My name's Omar, I'm a student member of Woodstead. Just carrying on the tradition of naming your past with a name like Omar, you can guess my family were Irish Catholics. I just wanted to make 2 points really, 2 points. The first one, in response to what the comment there said, I think that you raised an important question about how we as socialists talk to religious people, especially socialist movement that is typically irreligious, and I think that's a good thing. It is a question we have to grapple with, and I don't myself have all the answers, but I think one way that we shouldn't do it, I'm not saying that you say this, but one thing that has been characteristic of many people on the left of Britain, certainly in recent times, in a country as irreligious as Britain, is to either dodge the question or condescend. Basically, we don't talk to religious people as if they're children. We talk to them the way Rosa talked to the bishop, as adults, as grown-ups, and we challenge people's ideas. And as Marxists, we understand why people hold certain ideas. If we can't understand why people hold certain ideas, that we want to get rid of, then we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. I talk to my granddad. I don't like talking about religion. I don't like talking about God because I infantilize him, because I don't want to talk about the afterlife. Because I don't want to talk about that to an old man. I want to talk to which is a bad thing. When I talk to my parents, I do shout at them when they do something hypocritical. My dad goes to the mosque after going to the pub. Treat him like a grown-up. And that's an important thing. When we talk to a lot of religious people, poor in this country, whatever, we should talk to them and we should understand where they're coming from, but we talk to them as adults and we talk to them about their ideas. And secondly, I think, there's a million things we can talk about in differences between socialists and religious people, but I want to talk about the concept of salvation. I think that the one key difference that's irreconcilable about Christian belief that salvation, and not just Christian belief, Islam is the same, that salvation comes from a higher being, that comes from God. And in the English translation of the Internationale, the first line is, in the third verse, the first line is, no faith have we, no saviour from on high delivers, no faith have we in Prince or Peer. I think that's the key message that revolutionary Marxists are trying to put out there throughout society, is that to poor people, to working class people throughout the world, that their salvation won't come from people from up on high, or from people dressed in a certain way who will tell them how to achieve their salvation. The goal of revolutionary Marxism is to teach people not to have idol worship. Even though Stalinism in Eastern Europe did the opposite and created idols out of men, we want to tell people that working class people are able to take over society, take power for themselves, and transform society into the kind of society that I'm sure you want to see as well. And that's the key difference that is irreconcilable. You can't tell people that their salvation lies in God without forgetting that actually the way they will change society is through their own actions. Organised.
Thank you.
I'm Ben, I'm a student over at UCL. I wanted to pick up on 3 things that David talked about othering, about practical responses to the situation facing us, and about service to others. And the reason, I think the way that we would, I only can see the critique that I would make of sort of, of business owners, of capitalists, of bankers, as othering in the same way, because it's not, as Daniel pointed out, it's not a question of individual personal morality. And if our movement only ran on the steam of these people are bad people, they should be in prison, which some of our movement does run on, that's a failed movement. It's not going anywhere. It doesn't enable people to think about the world and how it functions. Then you're probably right that if it ever won, it would be in very bad. It would go to very bad places. It's a practical question, right? These people have all the money. And that's why I think when you talk about the sort of charitable approach as the practical response to those places, I think you're sort of factually wrong there, because this is, by analogy, something that faces us in the student movement a lot. Is there's been a lot of debate around housing in the past few years, and it's been a cause that the left tried to push up the agenda in the student movement. And then it comes to this debate. We've got X resources. They're not very much, because we don't have very much money. Do we set up a housing co-op, or do we set up a tenancy union? Do we use the resources that we have among ourselves to provide a little bit, or do we have the resources, do we take those resources and leverage out of the people who own all of the rest of the resources? And yeah, fine, as part of a revolutionary movement, it's probably true, if we were bigger, we would be running food banks, but we would be doing that as part of a strategy that saw that as inadequate, because we want to take all the bloody money that these people because that would be a lot more effective, a lot more practical in eliminating these problems, right? And so I guess the final point about service is, like, I don't think we disagree that sort of, whether you call it a life lived in service to others or solidarity or generosity, whatever, like, that is a good thing for people to experience. But with whose resources, right? We want to build a society in which we all serve each other with the money that the society has, not with the little scraps, sharing the little scraps that we have off the end of the table. So I think that, yeah, it all comes back to this question of it's not about individual morality, it's about where all the money is and where all the power is and where all the money flows and where all the power flows and the resources that our society has.
Thank you. My name is Arthur Thomas, I'm also a graduate work facility. A few years back I worked in an office with somebody who replied to my arguments about socialism, saying that's all very good, but actually society with all these good things you mentioned already exists. You don't have to imagine it, you don't have to fact it already exists. And I said, where? And he says, Saudi Arabia. Very devout Muslim. He says, well, look, in Saudi Arabia, everybody, it's a rule, everybody has to pay the zakat, the rich people. They have to pay a certain amount of their income to help the poor. It's an established system. This is wonderful. You may think that's a caricature, but if you look, you think, well, where else is religious organised charity really widespread? And the answer is the USA. USA, among relatively rich countries, has the highest level of religious observance, highest level of philanthropy, charitable giving, the highest level of voluntary charitable activity. And yet, compared to the other rich capitalist societies, it's a more unequal, more inhuman, more segregated, more brutal society. Basically, because all that charity, which includes lots of things done by very well-intentioned, nice people, which has good immediate results, that charity doesn't stop the class struggle, which, as Warren Buffett puts it, some people talk about the class struggle ending. Class struggle is going red hot, it's just that his side, the rich, are winning. And they're winning more in the United States than elsewhere, which is why it's more unequal, more inhuman, more segregated than countries where the labour movement is stronger, where the class struggle from the side of the working class is a bit stronger. So it doesn't do away with the class struggle. It doesn't substitute for it. It just alters the way it happens. Then, what happens to the class struggle in Saudi Arabia? Well, ask the migrant workers who do the work in Saudi Arabia. Is there no class struggle in Saudi Arabia? There's vicious class struggle in Saudi Arabia. It's just very one-sided. Right, so what we're saying is not people shouldn't help each other. What we're saying, is, well, look, everything's fine, but now we want to come in and start a class struggle that wasn't there. What we're saying is we want the other side to win in the class struggle. And when the other side, our side, starts moving the class struggle, that involves actually a lot of people helping each other. It involves a lot of people being trade union reps, where they help other workers. It involves a lot of people being members of socialist organisations, where you go and help picket lines, you go and help support workers in struggle. But we're not doing it because well, I'm your trade union rep, I'm a really charitable person. You obviously are a very needy person, so I'm going to help you. Here you are. Look, I can't win you higher wages, but, you know, here's a few bob that will get you by. You go, right, we together can struggle together and win and create a society where caring and helping isn't something that is done on the side to fill in the cracks, but it's the rule of society.
Vicky from Workers' Liberty. I was going to reply to Dan. You said if trade unions and whatnot were more relevant these days, we'd be opening food banks. No, we wouldn't. If we were more relevant these days, we'd be organising class struggle and resisting what the Tories are trying to do to us. There wouldn't be any need for food banks, right? And that's the perspective that we have to have. I think too many of the Labour movement have lost confidence, understandably, and look around for other groups that maybe appear to be doing good things or thriving. You know, if charity and religious groups are thriving because they're delivering food, money to food banks, that's not where we want to go. In Nottingham, we wanted to have a living wage campaign, and we were urged to look at the Nottingham Citizens, which are all about churches and so on. They seem to be getting a lot of people involved. They seem to be very active. We can do it. There are more of us, and that should be our vision of what we want to do. We want to mobilise, the Labour movement again, to go on offensive, to be confident. I missed the beginning of Rose's speech, but I feel like the bishop is kind of portraying himself. He's organising a constituency of well-meaning, middle-class people, who want to help. That's good, But our class is bigger than that, The working class is bigger, we're mobilised, we can do an awful lot more, right? You can join us when we get mobilised, right? And we will do many, much greater things, right? And the other way, I don't know, you kind of portrayed yourself as who is the top of your organisation? The Queen. The Queen is the head of state. The Queen.
I think he's saying second to top.
For goodness sake. Say what side? Picket line. What side are you on? In the class struggle, we have to choose a side. You can choose or not to choose a side, right? But we will choose a side.
Thank you. Annie.
So, love thy neighbour, right? I mean, who doesn't want to agree with that? I mean, I feel that perhaps I don't think Rosie was saying was that the criticism about socialists not believing in charity and stuff. I don't think that's at all what Rosie was getting at. So there's a few contributions at the beginning of that. I'll come back on. I think one of the things about being a consistent socialist is that you're also a consistent rational scientist. The same reason that we analyse the history of humanity and society and capitalism and draw the line of class as a distinctive scientific distinction between groups of people, we also analyse the history of human beings. And one of the things that's very clear, we're the most dominant species on the planet. We have risen above and can completely adapt and control our environment. And scientifically, we can show that that comes through evolution and the favouring of altruistic traits in human beings to benefit society. So human beings have developed to be as successful as they are because of a benefit where collaboration fosters the better evolution, the greater reproduction of humanity. Now, this is, I'm not saying that, where we've got to is just the consequence of our genes, but you can argue through science and through scientific method that collaboration and working together is through the betterment of society, and that has got us somewhere. That is innate to human beings. That is altruism. That's not love thy neighbour. We have a thing for that. It's altruism. We have a scientific definition for it, and that's part of socialism. Our distinction, I think, would be that we take all of that altruism, we take all of that love thy neighbour, but we want to empower it with democracy. We want to leverage that, we want to bring that and use that for the greater good. And the consistent application of democracy being the distinction and the difference, where love thy neighbour and altruism are not quite the same thing. Love thy neighbour doesn't have the democracy that socialism put on top of altruism.
Okay, Ian from Left Unity, Lambeth. I was a sort of a Calvinist Protestant, but I got fed up with my mother attacking Catholics. I think what we're missing is over the past 30, 40 years, there's been an undeclared class war against trade unions, against people on welfare, against the working class, and it's been going on for decades where people, they've brought in repressive legislation against trade unions, they've cut welfare benefits, they've been gone to town with it, and that's not part of it. It's both Labour and Tory have been doing that. And I think that the response to poverty, the poverty that they've created, cannot be seen simply in charitable terms of just giving on an individual basis. There has to be a collective response and a collective fight back against all of those measures. It does involve building solidarity, because I mean the point about collective response, we've taken a real hammering over the past 30 years where all of these our governments have encouraged individualism. They've gone to town on it to the nth degree, and it's not a passive thing like saying, oh, you can just make your own way in the world and that's fine. They've actually really, really hammered all working class organisations. And I think what we have to do in terms of, if there are food banks, I mean the way that we do things now, or certainly done in the past, is if we've had claimants unions, we defend people having their benefits being cut, but we encourage them to fight back collectively. Not just, I'm going to solve my personal problem, I'm going to join with other people who are affected in the same way that I am. Or if people in work, if redundancies that come along, then we get people solidarity action, not just from people in that workplace, but other workers as well. And we have a collective fight back. Because if we try and do it as individuals, then we've had it. That's about it.
Thank you. Becky.
I'm Becky. I have a brief spate of experimenting with Christianity, and I was simultaneously going to church and SWP meetings. And then I joined the SWP because there was something a bit Millenarian about the SWP Marxism, I think, that appealed to me. Anyway, and I can class with one word as liberty. Anyway, right. So I wanted to take up the idea of othering. And my understanding of othering is where usually powerful groups name other groups as the enemy, as we talked about, asylum seekers, benefit claimants. And what they're doing by that is they're using their power to create a false division. We talked about it being a myth. It's a false division. It doesn't exist in society. It's on the opposite basis, the vision of equality and human solidarity that's the basis of our
Hi, my name's Kieran, I'm with Works and Liberty. Just wanted to talk on two things, maybe our different conceptions of what future society might look like, and then perhaps bring God into it a bit as well. So you said that when we talk about othering, it's potentially a tool in the hands of the powerful, and I think that says something about what kind of a future society we might believe in, because I want a society in which there isn't a powerful anymore, and in which all those kinds of differences are levelled out between us. You might perhaps distinguish between charity and solidarity. Charity being a hand down from top to the bottom, solidarity being a levelling out of that difference. You said that, to paraphrase, a sort of part of self-realisation is to serve others. But again, I don't want a society in which servility is a necessity of life. I want a society in which all our human needs and wants are met, essentially. I think that's perhaps reflective of the entire religious conception of God anyway. God supposedly created this horrendous world which is filled with war and famine and natural disasters and viruses that kill children, and we're supposed to be grateful to this being. And in fact, not just grateful, but prostrate. And even heaven itself is simply a place where we just sing songs of praise to God all day. And if you disagree, or if you just don't think there's enough proof, or even if you just give in to sort of natural instincts and impulses, like who you're attracted to, or emotions that you feel, like maybe anger or jealousy, then you will be tortured forever in hell. If I were to encounter, people say, what would you do if you died and you woke up and you were at St. Peter's gates and you encountered God? What would you say? Well, that isn't a being, worthy of worship to me. That is like the ultimate embodiment of servility. And I would in fact say that such a creature is a megalomaniacal, death-worshipping, woman-hating fascist.
Absolutely.
I sometimes wind my grandmother up about, that the Pope dies, or being, a new Pope, and I'll say, no, I haven't got any ballot papers. It's supposed to be lost, and she doesn't really find it very She said sometimes about things that are going on in the church, and I said, well, why don't you wait, why don't you ask to put on the agenda of the next meeting? And she doesn't understand that either. What I'm interested in is how is the church of England governed, and what sort of control do members of the church have over its function. I think we need to think more about people becoming members of organisations, rather than sort of passive recipients of services or having indirect relationship. I'm very sceptical about social capital, because the clue is capital. It's talking about the very things that cannot necessarily be commodified, such as human, friendships or relations between natural neighbours. And my friend, who is both a Christian and a Marxist, wrote quite a good criticism of what the social capital movement suggested in its place. Collective agency. That's what we should be thinking about, helping people, our neighbours, as it were, to have their own, to be able to organise themselves. And just on food banks, what we really need to be looking at getting organised to do is auto-reduction. That's when you go into a supermarket and basically say, we're going to take this stuff, and this is how much you're going to pay for it. That would be a really good way of, putting the problem in terms of power of supermarkets.
Thank you. Liam. Liam? No? Yep.
Yeah, I'm Janine.
Oh.
I grew up Christian, professional bit now. A practicing Christian. Every single member of the family I'm from is a Christian, a practicing Christian, a very serious Christian. My dad's a Methodist lay preacher and a member of the synod. All sorts, okay, all sorts. And I would still have considered myself a Christian until about my mid-20s. So until a couple of years after I joined Workers' Everything, became a Marxist. It was, and in a way, I kind of love religion, you know, because the songs are great, and the buildings are beautiful, and people come in and look after you when you're sick, and make you tea when you're miserable, and it's all just kind of really nice, right? But the problem I have with it, actually, let's get down the nitty-gritty here, is I don't believe in God. I'd really love to be religious, but I don't believe in God. And not a job question, you're being a bishop and all right, but do you seriously believe there is this being? There's just this being that no one's ever seen, and I know people think they've talked to, but no one actually has ever talked to, that there's no evidence. Do you actually believe there's this separate being that is all good and all powerful? I'll take on board the point about God being within you, right? But actually the fundamental tenet of religion isn't that man created God, it's that God created man, okay? And maybe thousands of years ago, people started talking about God, they were talking about their innermost thoughts and feelings and spirits and whatever, and it was just an allegory or something. But at some point, people started taking it seriously, and they actually did believe there was a God. And to me, that's just a huge problem. What then becomes even more of a problem, this God, and I know you've almost certainly answered this question 1,000 times before, right? It's quite a cliche question, but I want to give the religious types another opportunity to answer it. This God is supposed to be 100% good and 100% powerful, right? So why didn't he stop the Holocaust? Why didn't he, right? Because either he couldn't, in which case he's not all powerful, or he could, but he chose not to, in which case he's a bastard. Right? So you're just going to have to explain. Finally, I will take it on good faith, if you forget the pun, that you are genuine, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-fascist, anti-homophobe, etc. Right? But now and historically, some of the worst sectarianism, the worst racism, the worst sexism, the worst homophobia has come from religion. It has. Religion doesn't just reflect an average level of bigotry in society. It's a much higher than average level. It's often the leader of it, etc. We should take on board, obviously, that socialists have questions to ask about pretty bad things being done in the name of socialism as well. But I do think we have to explain why it is that those really bigoted ideas are so rooted in and so propagated by religion.
So, there was a point in David's speech where he talked about, in society at the moment, the consensus around the welfare state is such that there are certain parameters within which we've got to operate. And we're taking those parameters as a given. Within those parameters, there's certain ways that you need to respond to human suffering. And that is, that's an argument that says, look, we're operating within certain parameters, that's what charities are for. And that's why charities good. And I was thinking about parameters, and I was also thinking about the fact that David's actually quite nice. And the vision of Anglicanism that David's putting forward is quite nice. And at the moment, and for the last period in British history, when you think of the Anglican Church, you think of things that are quite nice, you think of songs of praise. You don't think of the things that you associate with churches which operate with a different set of parameters. You don't think of the things that you associate with the Catholic Church in Ireland, which is operating in a much wider set of parameters. The Catholic Church in Ireland has historically had much more social power. You associate that church with the bodies of children being fished out from the backyards of religious schools and religious institutions and laundries, or the terrible suffering visited
upon sinful and fallen women in the laundries of the Catholic Church. Everyone knew what was going on there. My grandmother lived in Dublin, close to one of those institutions. She said everyone knew what was going on there, but you didn't speak out against it because you were afraid of the priest. We're not afraid to say these things in front of David now. Why is that? Also, because in this country, in the specific history that's going on here, the church has been forced to operate within certain parameters. Certain limits have been put on the power of this institution. And those parameters limit what the church can do. They also dictate that it's safe or even necessary for the church to present itself in a nice way, to give high office to very nice left-leaning people who are against racism. And the thing about these parameters, whether it's about what's possible, what's practical from the point of view of the welfare state, or what's possible from the point of view of the power of the clergy in your society, is those parameters are set by struggle. If you want to change those parameters, if you want to change what's possible, to drive back the power of the clergy out of society and win freedom for people, if you want to force society to accept the vision of the welfare state, you need sharp struggle. And what we want to do is we want a sharp ideological struggle that goes against what most people think, that goes against what is seen as the political consensus, which names our political enemies and goes after them, and others them. And that's what we're about. Now, in the bit where David talked about othering, I was quite disappointed because I think that you were evasive and dishonest. So you said that you were very angry about the othering of immigrants, you were very angry about the othering of benefit claimants, and then when you got on to the othering of bankers and oligarchs, which the bishop's letter denounces, you said, oh, well, you know, you've got to be a bit careful about all this othering sometimes. You know, sometimes othering can be a tool of the powerful, sometimes it isn't the best thing to do. And I think that what the church that reflects the church's strategy. It's against the sharp division. It's against the sharp confrontation and the sharp contradiction which is needed for the powerless to challenge the powerful, for people to shift the balance of power in society, shift those political parameters. It sees itself as a kind of glue. And you can see that from the way that, you know, you've got people in the Catholic Church, on the one hand, you know, do work amongst the poor and needy and get involved with United Against Fascism demonstrations. And then on the other hand, you've got the Queen and the Lord spiritual and God himself, actually. Like, it's this glue that tries to bind together the different parts of society, which are in contradiction. And that's what's pernicious. And that's why that thing about not othering bankers stood out to me. And I think actually that David should give a more full-throated and serious and explicit defence of why you think it's bad to say rude things about bankers and oligarchs.
Joel and Campfire and the Green Party, getting head down there, a few others. My dad was agnostic and my mum was Catholic, so they compromised and sent me to Methodist. So I'm not sure what that's done for me. No. Actually, I was one of the organisers of the 999 call for the NHS March, and actually the Methodist Church were very, very good to us on the way, and did so they were very good to us and gave us, you know, a lot of accommodation, help, and food and things on the way down, which was great. Probably, you know, like the first kind of socialist moment of my life was when I asked why we weren't giving, asked my parents why we weren't giving to Live Aid. I was 5, and I was told that we're not giving to Live Aid because your father believes that the government should pay for it all. Which is a very, you know, simplistic way to say to a 5-year-old that, you know, actually we don't believe in the principle of charity. And I mean, I don't believe in the principle. I don't believe charity should be needed. I believe that social solidarity is needed. And you know, I do love my neighbour. I do help my neighbour. But you know, there needs to be redistribution of wealth, and there needs to be, you know, democracy in the way that the resources are given out within the welfare system. So, I mean, Jesus said some good things, like about, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of an eagle than for a rich man to enter heaven. And he threw, the money lenders out of the temple and everything. But what I would say is this: it's good to love thy neighbour. You don't need to believe in God to do that. You don't need to go to church to do that. I imagine we all do that. It's not the preserve of religious people. We all do that all the time. There's the quote about bodies being fished out of the river. And we do know who's throwing the bodies in the river, and that's why I believe in class struggle. And I don't imagine that I'll win the bishop around a Marxist or a socialist worldview. But what I will say is that we do know who is throwing the bodies in the river. It's the profit motive. It is the capitalists. And I don't believe that we're othering them by saying that they're the problem. That's just how it is. The profit motive is squeezing people more and more and chucking the poorest people literally in the river. And what I would like to do is to, see, Church of England and other churches, just put the blame where it belongs to be, with the banks, with the capitalists, with the people who vote Tory that let them in. I mean, the Nazis, they didn't start with Jews or gypsies or homosexuals. They started with disabled people, with the Action T4 programme, which was they experimented with various different things. They murdered disabled people with drugs. They would just withhold food and water until they died. How is that latter thing any different from what this government is doing right now through the sanctions regime? Sick and disabled people are dying, are drowning in the river. And, the silence of a lot of people speaks absolute volumes. It's not othering people to have a go at the banks. The banks and the profit motives, and the profit motive is literally killing sick and disabled people. Now, with the Action T4 programme, actually the Catholic Church was some of the first people to stand up and say, actually, this is not right, what you're doing. And, it got toned down and toned down. That's what I'm calling the Church of England to say, actually, it's not right for the Tory government to put things in place that mean that sick and disabled people die. You have to take a stand on that, or really be doing nothing.
I'm Raquel, I'm a member of World City. I'm one of the believers that Sasha was talking about. I'm not Christian though. And I want to talk about the fundamental problem that I have with religion, and that is the notion that life is fair and somehow after life we are going to be either rewarded or punished, and there's going to be some sort of justice. And I think that the only reason why that notion exists is to stop people from organizing, from engaging in struggle. And if you think about it, at the same time that the church and most organized religions are actively making working class people not organized by saying that life is fair somehow, they're also saying that we should love the bosses and asking middle class people to donate some stuff to the poor to make them more likable. It doesn't seem to me like that is in good faith. I'm sorry, it just seems to me like there is some sort of intention in that, and is that nothing should be changed, really, in society?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sam. And just a point I want to make. I think it's odd that we can even consider to treat capitalism as a given or even something God-given, when it only came into being by breaking down a society that justified itself in exactly these terms, namely the feudal system. God's order under kings and high churchmen many centuries ago. And I think it's quite astoundingly bad faith for Christians to suggest that that's the given that we have to accept capitalism.
Tom.
Okay, my name's Tom Harrison and I'm
Even profoundly Anglican bishops themselves. I'm not going to return to the question about whether God exists or is just or not. I think the arguments to be made, and indeed been made since the Enlightenment. And what's more, about how one thing I will return to, at the risk of seeming repetitive, is this thing about othering and the othering of the rich, the othering of the capitalist class. Because I think there's a contradiction in what the bishop said, which is he said, I thought, very well, and in the turn phrase that actually I think socialists should adopt, after taking the bodies out of the river so many times, you should look up the river to see who's throwing them in. Now when you get to that point of going up the river to see who's throwing them in, I think it would be a bit rich if someone then said, well, listen, I don't think you should other the man who's throwing it. Loving the neighbour. I think in that situation it is rational and good on almost every level to other him to the extent of warning other people, perhaps people wandering towards him, that he's going to throw you in the river. And that something should be done collectively to restrain it. I agree with you. I'll echo what other people said about. I think you should have a certain human compassion for rich people and capitalists. So that it's not the case that you have all the injustices that you do under capitalism because the people at the top, by chance, are just very unpleasant and nasty. I'm sure that lots of extremely rich capitalists are perfectly decent people who have a lot of human empathy. The problem is a systemic problem. It's a problem of how society functions and how things are produced. And it would be by restraining the ability of a tiny minority to exploit the rest of us, and by reorganising society on a humane and democratic basis, that we genuinely can have a society in which it's possible to love our neighbour and to live in the kind of human communion that Christians talk about. But that does involve othering to the extent of pointing out who is doing the throwing in the river and arguing that they should be stopped.
You. Yes.
Okay. Right. I wanted to come back to the point about charity, because I think actually some of the contributions have been a bit soft on it. I agree with the hatred of charity, and I'm going to give you three examples to highlight this point. So, not very long ago, there was very few food banks in the UK, and there now is about 100,000, or there's an awful lot of them anyway. With lots of volunteers and members that care an awful lot about food poverty. As a potential force to change the way that we think about food and in this country, yet it only goes so far as to to alleviate the immediate problem, and it doesn't go any further. Where are the demonstrations, where's the direct action, where is the actual social force to actually change food poverty in this country? And I think charity fundamentally, historically, has played a role in alleviating the worst of the problems and going no further. The second, in work, charities are often pretty poor employers. Quite often, I don't know what the colleague that could have made a comment earlier on, I don't know what his employment status is like, but often they pay minimum wage and they use their charity status as being we're good, the work you're doing is more than, we can pay you a little bit less because you're working for a charity and you're doing good work. We're seeing this directly in the hospitals that I work in at the moment, where charities are continuing to act more like businesses than they do like charities. They're undercutting the wages of NHS employers in order to win contracts and win off the NHS. Therefore, people that were working in the NHS getting paid less to work for a charity. You then have the problem of charity, which is a top-down structure, looking at the problem from the point of view of the people that have the money and have the resources, not the people who have the problem. So if you look at something like fair trade, for example, where people who work in a coffee plantation in a fair trade one get paid less wages than the one next door that's not a fair trade one, because the money goes to the manager and not to the workers. So here we have a system where charity fundamentally does not act in the interest of the working class. People fundamentally holds us back when we need to be stepping forward. So I think the Christian charity should be strong and is right to be so.
A lot of you are still indicating, but we want to give the speakers time to come back, and particularly David, because he's got quite a lot to answer. So, so I'm closing it. I'm closing the list of the next person. unless there is anybody who wants to speak on this side of the debate. Yes, you do?
Yeah.
Yes.
You can have religious faith and you can be a socialist at the same time. You don't have to be one or the other. I liked a lot of what David said, but I'm the other side, on the Catholic side. There's a lot of things in my church that I don't agree with. There's a lot of things in socialism I don't agree with. And to say that people epitomise a religion is like saying some of the dickheads I know are socialists. Epitomise socialism and we don't. It's an idea. For me, Catholicism is being a good person as much as you can. If you're not good, you know, you're only human. And I do believe in God. I just think we don't have to be at odds. We can work together. We haven't got to where we want yet. And the reason why is because we're fragmented. Now, it's not just the left who are fragmented. It's people who don't consider themselves political, but are good people who want everyone to have food, a house, the things that we all think we should have. You're alienating them by saying, well, they're churchgoers, they've got nothing in common with us. There are people that go to church who are working class. So instead of having a division, why don't we think, well, we might actually do this if we all come together? We've all got common goals. By working together, we could get rid of the shit that we've got now.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. It was really interesting debate. I wanted to talk about my background, partly because it's quite funny. So my dad's a Methodist minister, and my mum's an evangelical Christian. And when I was growing up, they were both quite evangelical. So what they ended up with, in actual fact, was a straight atheist son, a gay Christian daughter, and a gay atheist daughter, and I'm the gay atheist. So that's fun for them. Right, so the main point that I really want to make is, like, unless you accept socialism as well as Christianity, what is the kind of Christian vision for change in society? And it's something that I've had a lot of discussions and debates with in my family and when I was studying and that still go on today. How do Christians propose creating a more equal society? And I accept the point that you can be a Christian and a socialist, but I think that to just be for loving your neighbour, or to just be for sort of wanting everyone to like not be othered and everyone to like love each other, it's just not. It doesn't seem to me to be a way to actually change anything. So do Christians propose creating a more equal society by like converting people? Is that how? Is that I don't see how that's going to work. Is it through the Bible? God knows people. Everyone knows that people have huge arguments about what that even means. And I would argue that a large section of the Bible, sorry Dad, are horrific. Is it just through charity? And also, like, there seems to be like a reliance on the afterlife and on the idea of God that, well, it's okay because there will be justice in the end, or it's okay because there will be some kind of afterlife. Where is God? Like, I agree with Janine. Where is God? Where is he or she or it? Like, what is it doing? I think if you want real change in society, I think you need to be a pastoral socialist because, like, throughout my reasonably short life so far, there's no other option that's been presented to me that has been of any value in proposing a way to change society for the better and for the good of humanity. I think that we have to have an organised working class. I think that class has to take power in society. It doesn't mean that you have to have a massive bloodbath. I don't support that. But we have to take power in society because it is in our interest to create a better society. It's not in the capitalist class interest to create a better society. It is in our interest. And that's what's fundamentally better, I think, about Marxism, is that it relates to our material need and our material position. Whereas just asking people to like believe in something and therefore to like be a bit nicer, sorry if I don't
Thank you. Thank you for all your contributions. We're now going to bring back both the speakers. We'll start with David. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. That won't give me a chance to respond to all the debate that we've had, but thank you for such a wonderful debate. And there's been passion, there's been enthusiasm, there's been a real desire to create a better society, and I want to applaud that and thank you for the courtesy as well with the contributions tonight. One or two themes have come up repeatedly, and you've had quite an interesting debate around the floor about, is charity always bad, or is charity sometimes good, but just not the whole of the answer? And I think I'm certainly of the view that charity does some good. It's not always a palliative. It's not always something that's simply slowing down the kind of class consciousness that people need to arrive at. And I think one thing that I guess I would add, perhaps what I said earlier, is simply that the capacity that charities have, whether they're church-based or other-based, to actually reach parts of society that kind of more organised, more state-delivered functions will never reach. I'm going to be doing a shift sometime soon with the Village Angels in Manchester. If you don't know about the Village Angels, it's the group that go out in the Canal Street area, the LGBT part of the community, of a Friday night, Saturday night, probably Sunday night as well, to kind of, just watch people, help people to be safe, help people not to get themselves exploited when they're out there, enjoying the club culture of that particular part of Manchester. And I applaud that charity. It can reach, because it is largely LGBT people themselves who have the confidence of other LGBT people, and some of those are Christians who I know very well, they're members of my own churches. They can reach in a way the state would never be trusted to reach. And the state would never be trusted to reach into a lot of the more oppressed and minority and marginalised groups in our society. So I think there's a particular role for charities and the reach that they have. I'm really fascinated by the conversation that we've had around kind of the individual versus the kind of the corporate. Is this about personal morality, or is this about what the Metropolitan Police was called a few years ago, institutional racism? That isn't necessarily simply the aggregate of the individuals there. It's something that is inherent in the structures. And I take your point. I think I want to agree with you that a lot of what is wrong in society, the inequality that makes our society poorer for all, or certainly for the vast majority, is actually structural rather than about individual. And I guess that's what I'm getting with, because I think I feel rightly sort of properly critiqued around some of the othering argument there. That it isn't the individual person who may be, by his standards, by the society that she has been brought up in, by the education that they have had, trying to do their best, but is a person of great wealth and great power within a corporate organisation. And when I talk to those people, sometimes I have to do, one of the reasons I've always worn sandals as an adult is so I don't look entirely like them, whatever else I might have to do in this life. One gets this impression sometimes that they too are trapped, they're limited in the possibilities, the potential that they have, the choices, the parameters that they can engage with. I'm not trying to evoke pity for them, but I think if I'm saying don't other, I'm saying perhaps I'm agreeing with you that some of this is about corporate rather than individual sin, wrongness in our society. It's not just about the way that individuals behave. And so, let's go at the banks, but not necessarily the individual people who work in those banks. The Church of England has been working pretty strongly in these last couple of years on credit unions, on how can we encourage credit unions to develop as a good bottom-up response to people's banking, saving, lending needs. Now, I would have thought credit unions are something that a socialist would want to approve of as a way of taking finance away from the bankers and putting it in the hands of ordinary people. Let's work together on things like that, because I've got a constituency out there that is ready and willing to work with partners in it. Are bishops paid too much? I really must answer that one. I thought about that. I thought I might be asked that. So I thought about that on the train coming down. And I reckon that my stipend, as it's called, plus what my wife earns, together adds up to about the equivalent of 2 pretty average working wages in this country. So I don't think we're not hugely paid by that comparison, and we work together as a team. you can calculate what an average working wage is.
You do get a free house.
I've got for the time being a free house until I retire, then I don't have the free house. But actually, I find that my faith empowers me. I think my faith inspires me to engage. It makes me brave enough to go and sit alongside the homeless people in the centre of Manchester of a morning and simply value them by being prepared to hear their stories. And I'm struck and humbled by the way they want to engage and they want to talk and how they feel about being spoken to and listened to as a human being in those situations. And I think that is something that I'm empowered to do because of my religious faith. Torture in hell, I don't believe in that God either. I think there's a God that none of us believe in that has sometimes been announced Sally in this conversation. I'm probably more Darwinist than the rest of you because I actually believe in evolution. I actually believe that societies can evolve and change, and it doesn't have to be by strong, violent revolution and that climatic change. I do believe it's possible for society to get better, and I would like to encourage this society to get better. Charities can be poor employers. Crikey, have you followed some of the stories in the last few years about trade unions as employers and the way they treat some of their employees? What's the Christian vision for changing society? I've got a phrase I've used for many years now. I call it prophetic action. It's you say, if this society was just and fair, this is what it's looked like. I can't change it everywhere, but I will do something that changes it here. So when I brought together, me and a group of mates brought together a group of young unemployed people, formed into a co-op, they built their own homes, and every penny they made that cheaper than it would have been to have them commercially built, they split between themselves to equip those homes to live in. That for me is prophetic action. That's what it's like when people are given the dignity that God wants them to have. And that again is the sort of thing that I would have thought would appeal to a left of centre group. So that prophetic action, making a sign, this is how the world should be. Putting that publicly before the world, that's what I've tried to do. That's what I'm going to try and go on doing. Thank you for listening, and Rosie rightly gets the last word.
All right, it's getting excessive.
Okay, slightly more scattered than how I started, but just very quickly, Dan, the thing about being more nuanced about religion, it wasn't a debate about religion. It wasn't a debate about whether God exists. I mean, I could do that debate as well, and depending on the audience, what I might say might change a little bit. You know, if I'm going to my trade union branch and there's a lot of religious people there, I'm not going to insult their religion, or make the kind of jokes I might make with some friends, privately. I take those things seriously. Of course people can believe in God and be a socialist. Of course they can. I'm very good friends with a lot of people who have very strong religious beliefs. But what I don't do is patronise them. So if I'm talking to a Muslim friend of mine who's my daughter is best friends with in school, we're walking home, she's a teacher in the school. And I said to her, she's very strict Muslim, we were talking about Ramadan, and she was talking about having to get up early to pray. And so I asked her about that openly. And I can't remember how it came up now, but it came up about evolution. And she said, oh, yeah, I don't believe in it. I said, but you're a teacher in a school that teaches evolution. How can you not believe in evolution? Oh, I believe in some evolution, but I just don't believe in the evolution that we used to be monkeys. I was apes, not monkeys. But we talked about it, but I didn't pull my punches, and she wasn't offended. You can talk to people in a very, very open way about their religion without offending them, without being rude, but you can be direct and say, well, I'm an atheist. This is what I think. This doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand how you can refute all this scientific evidence. It doesn't have to be aggressive, but this wasn't a debate about religion. So, nuance, I don't know, it's a bit of a funny thing to say, really. I tell my dad read my speech before I came, my dad's a socialist. I'm not like anyone who's been brought up in a religious household. I wasn't. I've always just known there wasn't a God. My dad said, don't be too hard on the bishop, Rosie. I heard him on the Today programme, and he'd gone out to see the homeless, and, taking some Tories around to, and I think the problem here is actually, I don't think you're typical Anglican. That's part of the issue. I was only half joking about my caricature of Anglicans. Remember the argument about the ordination of women priests? The Anglican Church isn't just the C of E. And the C of E is not a static thing. Yeah, okay, it's a bit nicer these days. But the fact is, I'm sure, I think probably you'd be for gay marriage in the church. Yeah, it's not going to happen. Because you're not typical of the Anglican Church. So it's a bit of an odd debate to have had. So yes, David puts his thing forward and that's fine. But I was debating a bishop of the Church of England, the head of which is the Queen. This is an organisation that sits in the House of Lords. that is a statutory provider of education in our society, in our country, that runs hundreds of state schools that teach that God made the world and evolution, that confuses the hell out of children, half of whom leave school not believing in God anyway. But if you have faith schools for them, you can have faith schools for the more fanatical religions, or for fanatical elements of Christian religion. Look, this is not just a benign, harmless, funny little organisation, okay? I'm a secularist. They should not be in government. They should not be running schools. Religion is a private matter. If I was debating David, the individual, what I would have said would have been very different to debating David, a bishop of the Church of England. I just want to finish on hatred. I don't want to hate people. I'm a nice person. I'm a nurse. I'm a nurse. I used to work I'm a health visitor. I used to work in the hotel for homeless people in Westminster. And I dug into my pocket many times because the situation people were in is just leaving families with no food in their cupboard because their benefits have been cut because she's an Eritrean woman who doesn't speak English and filled her form in wrong. Yeah. I mean, this is just wrong. But what I really don't like is the term unfortunate. She's not unfortunate. An unfortunate person dropped their pound down a drain just as the bus pulled up, and I might give them a pound. That's unfortunate. She's not unfortunate. She's a victim of a system that has put her in that position. People don't lose their job like, oh, where did I put my job? Oh, that's unfortunate. Their job was taken from them. They were sacked. These are things that are done to people by another class of people. They're not unfortunate. And I don't think we should see them as unfortunate. We want to make them strong. So I do hate, because I hate the people who do that. My family's from Liverpool, you know. The Sun newspaper, after the Hillsborough disaster, what they said about Liverpool fans. The other side of my family are miners. Watch something about Orgreave or read about the miners' strike and tell me not to hate the system that did that, or Margaret Thatcher. Don't tell me that hate is a human emotion, anger, passion. You have to have those things if you want to change the world. You have to differentiate between people who deserve your compassion and people who deserve your contempt. And I think that's where I'd finish, is that those emotions are not bad emotions. There's nothing wrong with having those emotions, as long as you do something about them. So.